All right, so you ready to do some time traveling?
Always up for a trip through the archives.
Great. Because this time, we're heading back to late 2016,
Hmm.
like right after Trump won the election.
Oh, yes.
Remember that time? Everyone was kind of on edge, wondering what a Trump presidency would actually look like.
I think we all had a bit of whiplash.
Definitely. And you wanted to look specifically at this idea of a trade war between Canada and the U.S. brewing back then.
A real what-if scenario with the potential for some serious global consequences, right?
Exactly. I mean, even just reading the articles from back then, you can feel the tension.
Oh, absolutely. The stakes were incredibly high.
And you can't forget just how interconnected the U.S. and Canadian economies are.
Totally. Even just the threat of tariffs had the potential to send shockwaves through both countries.
Okay, so paint the picture for us. What exactly was going on?
Well, picture this. Trump, fresh off his victory, throws down the gauntlet.
Okay.
He threatens a 25% tariff on all Canadian imports.
Wow, 25.
Unless Canada meets his demands on migration and drug flow.
So not messing around at all?
Nope, not at all. It was definitely a power play.
What strikes me is how this is about using tariffs like a political tool,
Yeah.
not just an economic one.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. It was Trump signaling he was willing to use economic leverage to get what he wanted politically, setting a pretty aggressive tone right out of the gate.
And it wasn't exactly subtle either.
Oh, no, not at all.
I came across this quote from one of Trump's social media posts where he casually refers to Trudeau as the governor of the great state of Canada.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
it's almost like a backhanded compliment or something.
Definitely raised a few eyebrows, that one.
It really shows you the kind of dynamic at play here.
Doesn't it? You've got the U.S. with all its economic might basically trying to dictate terms. And Canada, well, they're trying to assert their sovereignty while protecting their interests.
So how did Canada respond to this? Did they just kind of roll over?
Not a chance. They took a strategic approach, a two-pronged approach.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
First, they started getting ready with some retaliatory tariffs of their own.
Makes sense. An eye for an eye.
Right. They knew they couldn't just sit there and take a 25% hit without fighting back.
I guess I'm curious about, how do you even choose which goods to target with something like that?
Yeah, that's the tricky part.
Is it just picking whatever the U.S. needs the most?
It's more nuanced than that. You've got to strike a balance between, causing some economic pain and also applying political pressure.
Nice.
Remember that 10% tariff Canada slapped on yogurt back in 2018?
Wait, the yogurt duty.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I vaguely remember that.
Most of the yogurt affected actually came from a plant in Wisconsin, then House Speaker Paul Ryan's home state.
Whoa. I see where you're going with this.
It wasn't a coincidence, not at all. Canada knew exactly where to hit to make a point.
So yogurt can be a weapon of war. Who knew? It's crazy how these, totally random products can become strategic pawns in these big trade negotiations.
Right. The world of trade can be pretty strange sometimes.
Okay, so that was one prong of their response. What was the other?
Alongside the retaliatory tariffs, Canada also started bolstering their border security. They were trying to, address some of the concerns that Trump had raised, even if some folks thought those concerns were a little overblown.
Kind of like saying, hey, we're taking you seriously even if we don't totally agree with you.
Exactly. A smart move, I think. It showed they were willing to listen and act, but also stand their ground.
And then, to make things even more interesting, Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario at the time, jumps into the fray.
Oh, yeah. Ford. He definitely didn't shy away from the spotlight.
Not at all. He came out swinging, threatening to cut off energy exports to, 5 U.S. states.
Pretty bold move for a provincial leader.
He was quoted saying, "We need to be ready to fight." Strong words. Was he all talk, or did he actually have the power to do that?
Well, that's debatable. It wasn't really within his jurisdiction to make that kind of call unilaterally. But it does highlight a few things, The heightened political climate, that sense of urgency, and the possibility of, let's call it, friction between the provincial and federal governments in Canada.
I bet things were getting pretty hectic behind the scenes.
Oh, absolutely. Flurry of meetings between Trudeau and the premiers, discussions about border security plans, requests for more resources to deal with potential fallout, you name it.
So much for a relaxing holiday season, right?
Right. What were some of the specific things they were talking about in these meetings? What were the biggest concerns?
Yeah. What were they worried about?
Well, you got to remember, this wasn't just a federal issue. It impacted each province and territory differently. So coordinating a unified response across all those different levels of government, that was a major challenge.
Right. Canada's political structure is definitely more intricate than just a single decision maker.
Exactly. And one detail that really stands out to me from the sources is the mention of fentanyl.
Oh,
Remember,
yeah.
this was during the peak of the U.S. opioid crisis.
Right.
And Canada was increasingly seen as a source of illicit fentanyl coming into the U.S.
Ah, so it wasn't just about economics then. You had
Yeah.
drug trafficking and public health concerns all tangled up in this trade tension, too.
Exactly. Multiple layers, each with its own set of complexities.
Sounds like a recipe for some serious headaches for everyone involved.
You could say that again.
Uh,
And then there was the looming question of what would happen once Trump actually took office.
Right. Would he actually follow through on his threats?
Exactly. Would his tough talk translate into concrete action? And if so, how would Canada respond?
So much uncertainty.
Yeah.
It must have created some pretty intense debates within Canadian political circles.
Oh, for sure. The NDP, they were pushing for a strong, unified front against what they saw as Trump's bullying.
Makes sense.
But even within the Liberal Party itself, there were those who argued that, look, aligning with U.S. demands, even if it meant making some concessions, had to be the priority.
So a real dilemma. National pride versus economic pragmatism.
It's a tough call. Was there any indication of which way the government was leaning at that point?
Well, it's hard to say for sure from these sources, but I found this quote from Liberal MP Sean Casey. Pretty interesting. He said, if his demands are aligned with the best interests of Canada, the perception of the relationship doesn't matter.
Wow.
Pretty blunt, right?
Yeah.
Suggests they were willing to put practical outcomes ahead of appearances, even if it meant looking weak on the world stage.
It really puts you in their shoes, doesn't it? Imagine you were advising Trudeau in that moment. What would you recommend? Stand firm, negotiate, try to find common ground, something else entirely. It's a fascinating thought experiment. It makes you realize how much was riding on those decisions. You know, what could have happened if things went the wrong way.
Totally. Looking back, I almost feel like some kind of conflict was bound to happen with Trump in the White House.
And don't forget, this was before he was even officially president.
Right.
Everyone was just trying to figure out what he'd actually do based on what he'd said during the campaign.
Must have been unnerving. Speaking of trying to figure out what someone might do, let's get back to Doug Ford's energy export threat.
Ah, yes. Premier Ford.
Might have just been bluster. But it does make you think about how something like a fight between provinces could have messed up Canada's whole plan.
Exactly. You've got the federal government trying to show a united front to the U.S., and then you've got a premier basically going rogue.
Talk about mixed messaging.
Yeah.
It really shows how complicated this whole thing was.
Doesn't it? So many layers.
You've got the economics of it all, the political maneuvering, the public health side with the fentanyl, and then how that all plays out within Canada itself.
And we haven't even touched on the human side of things.
Oh, right.
Think about, like, a business owner whose whole livelihood depended on trade with the U.S.
Yeah.
Or a family with loved ones on both sides of the border. All that uncertainty must have been so stressful.
For sure. It's easy to get caught up in the politics, but real people were being affected by this.
Absolutely. It makes you think about the long-term impact on the relationship between Canada and the U.S. too, right?
Oh, interesting.
Like, even if things didn't completely blow up, did this create a sense of distrust that stuck around? Did it change how Canada approached things with the U.S. going forward?
It's hard to say for sure, but it does show you how one event can have ripple effects for years.
For sure. It also shows how fragile the global trading system can be.
How so?
You've got two of the closest allies in the world, huge trading partners, suddenly on the verge of a trade war.
Yeah, that's not a good look.
What kind of message does that send to other countries?
Yeah.
It almost makes it seem like using tariffs as a political weapon is just normal.
Creates this feeling of suspicion and instability.
Exactly. And once you go down that road, it can be really hard to turn back. Makes you wonder what other options were there.
Right. Like if a trade war had actually started, what would happen? Don't even want to think about it. Supply chains messed up, prices going through the roof, businesses shutting down, not to mention the damage to the political relationship.
Rebuilding trust can take a long time. And keep in mind, this wasn't an isolated incident.
Right. It was part of a bigger trend.
Exactly. We've seen more and more protectionist ideas popping up around the world in recent years. This was like an early warning sign.
It's like we thought this whole globalized free trade thing was just how things worked, and then suddenly everything's changing.
It's a good reminder that things are always in flux. The global order is constantly evolving, and we can't take anything for granted. The rules of the game can change in a heartbeat, and you have to be ready to adapt.
for sure. This is making me think about leadership in times of crisis.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like, how do you balance all these competing interests? How do you keep everyone calm and on the same page when everything's so uncertain?
Great questions. And I think this whole situation gives us some really interesting examples of different approaches to leadership.
Like what?
Well, you've got Trudeau trying to project an image of calm and reason, but also preparing for a potential fight.
Makes sense.
And then you've got Ford, who's much more confrontational, maybe playing to his supporters.
Right. And they're both operating within their own political systems.
Yeah.
Each has its own rules and pressures.
Must have been a tough balancing act for everyone involved. It really shows how important it is to have a clear strategy, a unified message.
So everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. And you have to be able to communicate that message effectively, both within your own government and to the rest of the world.
But even with the best plans, there's always going to be some level of unpredictability, right? Especially when you're dealing with someone like Trump, who seemed to thrive on shaking things up.
Definitely. That was one of the things that made him so fascinating, but also so unsettling. No one ever knew what he was going to do next.
Reminds me of that saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Oh, yeah.
Canada had to manage this relationship that was super important to them, but also could explode at any moment.
It's a tricky dance, that's for sure.
It makes you wonder, like, how much power does a smaller country like Canada actually have when they're up against a giant like the U.S.?
That's a tough one. I mean, on the one hand, the U.S. economy is so much bigger.
They definitely have more weight to throw around.
Right. And they have a lot of control over global trade.
So it's not exactly a fair fight.
Well, on the other hand, Canada has its own strengths.
Like what?
Well, they have resources the U.S. needs. They have a good reputation internationally. And they can team up with other countries to put pressure on the U.S.
So it's not a completely lost cause.
Not at all. It just takes careful planning and skillful execution.
So being smart about it.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the big takeaways from all of this. Even when it seems like the odds are stacked against you, you can still stand up for yourself. You can protect your own interests and come out on top.
That's actually kind of inspiring. Shows you that a smaller country can hold its own against a superpower if they play their cards right.
And it reminds us how important diplomacy is. Finding things you can agree on, building bridges, even when there's a lot of tension.
It also makes you think about how a similar situation would play out today.
Ooh, good question.
Would everyone act the same way? Would things end up differently?
It's hard to say for sure. A lot has changed since 2016.
New trade deals, new alliances, different political climates in both countries.
And of course, there's a different president in the White House now, which definitely changes the whole equation.
For sure. So there's no way to know for sure what would happen today.
But by looking at past events, studying how things unfolded, we can get a better understanding of how these international relationships work.
So using the past to understand the present and maybe even anticipate the future.
Exactly. I think that's one of the reasons these deep dives are so interesting. They give you a new perspective, help you see how everything fits together.
And they remind us that history isn't just something that happened a long time ago. It's still affecting us today.
So well put. This has been a really eye-opening conversation.
I agree.
It's amazing what you can learn from just a few articles from a few years back.
It really is. It's like a time capsule, right? Not just showing us what happened, but how people were feeling back then, their anxieties, their hopes.
And it makes you appreciate how tough these leadership roles are. The decisions they have to make, how many people are affected by them.
Makes you realize the importance of staying informed.
Definitely.
Understanding how current events fit into the bigger picture.
Mhm.
And talking about these things, having these kinds of discussions.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power, right? And thinking critically is essential in a world where there's so much information coming at you all the time.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. What a conversation.
It really has been. It's been great exploring this whole chapter of Canada-U.S. relations with you.
It's been a wild ride, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like we've just scratched the surface of this whole trade war thing.
Yeah, there's so much more we could unpack.
We might have to do a follow-up deep dive sometime. But for now, I'm curious. What surprised you the most about this whole situation?
It's just how many different factors were involved. You had the global economy, domestic politics, the whole fentanyl issue, and then even personal stories of people caught in the middle. It really shows that trade policy isn't just about numbers. It affects real people.
Totally. I keep thinking about those families with relatives on both sides of the border, businesses trying to stay afloat with all this uncertainty.
And all that uncertainty takes a toll, right?
Yeah,
The constant threat of tariffs, all the talk about conflict, it creates a lot of stress and anxiety. It makes people distrust each other, not just governments.
it's like this feeling that everything could fall apart at any moment.
And remember, this was all happening when things were already pretty politically divided, especially in the U.S. Trump's election had shaken things up, and this trade dispute just added to the tension.
It was definitely a sign of things to come,
Hmm.
a preview of how Trump would approach foreign policy.
It makes you wonder how this whole experience changed how Canada dealt with the U.S. after that. Did they become more cautious, more assertive?
Maybe a little bit of both. I'm sure there were a lot of meetings in Ottawa trying to figure out how to balance standing up for Canada's interests with keeping a good relationship with their biggest trading partner.
And it wasn't just about Canada and the U.S., right? This had implications for the whole global trading system.
How so?
Well, it showed that the U.S. was willing to use tariffs as a weapon, even against their allies.
It must have been a wake-up call for a lot of countries.
Exactly. They had to start thinking about how reliant they were on the U.S. and whether they needed to find other trading partners.
It also raises questions about the future of globalization. Was this the start of a move away from free trade, back towards protectionism?
Those are big questions. And to be honest, we're still trying to figure out the answers. The trade tensions from the Trump era haven't completely gone away. They've just changed shape and new challenges have come up.
Yeah, things are always changing. The global landscape is constantly shifting, and so is economic power.
In that kind of environment, you have to be flexible.
Be able to adapt to new situations.
Exactly. You have to be strategic and ready to defend your interests.
This whole conversation has really shown me how important it is to understand history, not just as dates and facts, but as a way to navigate the present and maybe even see what's coming next.
I couldn't agree more. By looking at past events, we can see what worked and what didn't.
Learn from the mistakes of those who came before us so we can make better decisions today.
And history isn't over, right? It's still shaping our thoughts and our choices. The things we do today will have an impact for years to come.
That's a powerful thought. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage everyone listening to keep thinking about what happened back in 2016. Think about how it connects to what's happening now. Ask yourself, what can you do to create a more just and fair world?
That's a great question to think about. It's going to take all of us working together to build a better future.
Well said. Thanks for joining me on this trip back in time. It's been fascinating to explore this moment in Canada-U.S. relations.
It's been my pleasure. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those deep dives going.